Morning everyone, we are Group 5. We'll be looking at deregulation in the airline industry, and our two companies are SAS and Ryanair. So my name's Ben.
I'm Joanne.
I'm Katja.
I'm Lou. I'm Adam.
So a brief outline of what we're looking at today. We'll start with deregulation on the industry and how that changed their journeys. And we'll be looking at other factors aside from deregulation, such as management and marketing, and then we'll be assessing the future prospects of our companies going forward. So Ryanair was founded in 1984 in Dublin, and it began with a single route from Waterford in Ireland to London. It was a 15-seat aircraft, just the one, carrying a few hundred passengers a year. The plane was so small that all the crew members had to be below 5'2" to use it. And since then, it's become Europe's largest budget airline, carrying 79 million passengers a year to 180 locations from 16 UK airports. They have a very basic business model, but basically they sell the ticket as cheap as they can while keeping their own costs to a minimum. Their CEO, Michael O'Leary, said, "We don't have a brand strategy at all, we just want to pie high and sell it cheap." They also have a very unconventional marketing strategy in that they spend none of their budget on advertising and rely purely on newspaper headlines and publicity stunts to get into public eye. SAS was founded in 1946 by the state aviation authorities of Denmark, Norway and Sweden. They again started with one route from Scandinavia to the US, but by 1951 all pre-existing Scandinavian routes had been incorporated into SAS. They have a history of innovation. They were the first airline to fly over the North Pole, which cut transatlantic flight times massively. In 1965 they were the first to introduce online bookings, and in 1982 were the first to offer a business waiting lounge. They offer higher quality commercial travel. So in 1981, their CEO Jan Carlson said they wanted the company to become a businessman's airline, which would be the best airline in the world for frequent flyers. But recently they've been expanding more into leisure markets to keep up with their competition. So in 2012 they added 52 new flight paths to their routes, most of which were aimed at the leisure market. So we have a brief look at the stats of the two companies on the board. We can see their revenues are roughly the same, 4.9 and 4.6 billion. But then if you look at the number of flights they both do, Ryanair offers almost more than double the flights of SAS, which shows that SAS clearly offer a higher quality but more expensive service if they're making the same revenue. If we then look at profits, where Ryanair far exceeds SAS at the bottom there, it shows how Ryanair prioritise cost cutting, since again they use double the flights but employ 5,000 fewer staff. This means their profit margins are vastly different. SAS cannot quite make 0.5% profit, while Ryanair are well over 10. Now we're going to hand over to Johan and Katja, who are going to talk about regulation.
Yes, so one of the major changes for these two companies was regulation. So what is regulation really? Well, it's in short-term words a controlled market. The governments try to resist competition and globalization in their industry, which makes that with no competition, the customers have to pay higher prices. Okay, continue to the next slide. In the airline industry, there were two different regulation types. The first, domestic regulation. 1985, 90% of all airlines were owned by governments. This made that governments could control pricing, employment practices, levels of output, etc. The second regulation was the international regulation. It was controlled by an association called IATA, and they had control over conditions of service, like in-flight service, seating arrangements, etc.
So why actually regulation didn't work at that time? There were three main failures. They failed to create a stable industry. Monopoly was, most of the time, monopoly of national-owned companies was there. They failed to satisfy public interest. Because of the monopoly was competition. Their competition brought to high prices. So public was not satisfied. And then inefficiency of both national and private companies. Often standards that government said they were higher than needed. So companies couldn't earn as much profit as they wanted to be. The turning point deregulation started in 1987, and then it was completed in the European Union in 1997. Now we'll try to discuss the question why and how did Ryanair and SAS responded on the deregulation of 1990s. And one of the first features of deregulation was open access to the European routes. It was created single aviation Asian market. So for example, Ryanair, Irish company, now they could fly not only outside of the UK, but now they could fly from Germany to France, for example. So Ryanair used this, there was huge success for them. They could compete with European airline companies. They got the opportunity to open additional routes, and then you can see how fast they grow. In 1997, it was opened the very first European route. In less than 20 years, now they have 180 destinations. For them, deregulation was a huge success.
SAS, on the other hand, they tried more to protect their own market as they had before deregulation. One of the major strategies they developed was to form a star alliance with other major airlines in Europe at that time, for example Lufthansa. And this was to increase the competitiveness towards these new companies as Ryanair. So the second feature is the freedom of price setting. Before deregulation, companies couldn't set their own prices as they wanted. The governments controlled like a minimum price for each route. But now this was free, so companies could set whatever prices they wanted. For SAS, this didn't change as much. They focused more on high services because they had very high costs, so they had to keep up with the same prices, and they had a really hard time to cut these costs.
At the same time, Ryanair, they used this opportunity to introduce low-cost fares. They had massive promotions, and through deregulation, they won customer sympathy. For example, now you could fly for only £6. It's just outrageous. It's less than a ticket for the train or coach. And the last feature of deregulation, that managers of companies, they got opportunity to control the company inside, policy inside the company. So, and Michael Leary, the chief executive of Ryanair, he used this as much as he could. So he increased the efficiency of the staff. So now they work till the Ford Max, and Ryanair also popular for, they're famous for their poor customer service. Now for their controversial public image, they say as long as you don't pay, we don't need to smile. So controversy of the manager will be discussed later on by Louise.
SAS, they kept the same policy as before deregulation. As Ben said, they're formation of three governments, so they have to keep about the same policy as the Scandinavian Union. And in Scandinavia in general, we have certain policies as quality for quantity and take care of the environment, etc. They also provided with the same public routes as before and focused more on their first-class service. Now Louis is going to talk about some other factors.
So today I'll be addressing the other factors besides deregulation that have affected the relative performances of SAS and Ryanair over the past 10 years. The first and most important factor I'll address is that of both companies opposing business models, with Ryanair offering a no-frills model, while the SAS operates under a full-service carrier approach. No frills describes a business model in which only the flight's bare essentials are provided. The consumer is paying for the journey and the journey alone. Extras such as refreshments or baggage charges come at an additional cost. Alternatively, SAS operates as a full-service carrier, providing a more luxurious, comfortable, but more expensive service, marketing itself as being the greenest, most punctual, highest quality service on the market. A study comparing the two business models found that no frills produced employees that are 9 times more productive than that of a full-service approach. Likewise, flights per hour, along with passengers per hour for no frills, were far ahead of the business model used by SAS. This level of efficiency can actually be highlighted by this quote here by Lotte Linguist, who is the Nordic manager for Ryanair, saying there's nothing more expensive than an aeroplane on the ground, and essentially boasts their 25-minute plane turnaround policy, which is incredibly impressive. So using specialisation and economies of scale, Ryanair drastically reduced their costs over SAS. So while Ryanair was operating just the Boeing 737, SAS actually used 8 different types of aircraft, as we can see on the left there, all of which required separate fuelling techniques, different specialist engineers. Therefore, Ryanair can achieve this 25-minute turnaround period, along with reducing costs of things like spare parts, and they have less of a need to hire fewer engineers and fewer staff members. They don't have to be retrained to operate on different aircrafts. So in contrast, SAS often use cost reduction programs involving job cuts, such as the loss of 300 of its staff in 2012. Ultimately, while Ryanair keeps costs low, SAS spends far too much money ensuring its services are only marginally more comfortable and far more environmentally friendly, items low on the consumer's checklist. Secondly, the relative performances of Ryanair and SAS were impacted by the 2008 recession. Ryanair's flights are an inferior gig. That goes to say they are of lower quality, but more importantly, a lower cost than the flights of SAS. This top graph here actually shows, it shows the real household disposable income. Actually shows it's shrinking in these last two sections, which is 2010 and 2011. And if we go to the next graph, which is the comparison, which is Ryanair's quarterly operating profits, we see 2010 and 2011 to be immensely profitable years for Ryanair. In fact, they're most profitable to date by that point. So in linking this to the previous factor, by operating under a no-frill scheme, Ryanair automatically equipped itself for the economic crisis. While the leadership structure of SAS meant they couldn't react quickly or decisively enough, something I'll talk more about now. The third crucial factor that explains the relative performances of both companies is their management and marketing. SAS leans more towards the garden style of management, its UK branch being named the 73rd best company to work for in 2013. Despite this, however, its leadership structure is weak and cluttered. It's owned by 3 governments, Norway, Sweden and Denmark, as well as insurance companies and investment banks, making any decision slow and cumbersome. And I think here you could probably point to their slow reaction to 9/11 or their kind of underreaction to the 2008 economic crisis, where they couldn't cut costs quickly enough. In stark comparison, however, Ryanair's machine-style management works better in relation to their business model and its cost-cutting endeavours, with its huge levels of productivity leading to comparatively cheaper labour. The focal point of Ryanair's management team is their charismatic CEO, Michael O'Leary. Along with driving Ryanair's increasing cost-cutting endeavours, he manages to stir up light-hearted controversy surrounding the company, something he calls generating noise. And on this next slide, we have examples of him generating noise. These top 3 ones here, publicity stunts by Ryanair, and their headlines, they're all punchy and powerful, and they didn't cost them anything. In contrast, these ones by Ryanair, SAS rather, ones involving animals, and I think it's a bit of a, it's subtle, it's more complex, it's having more legroom, but they paid for them. They're not as punchy, they don't have as much impact. So I'm now going to pass over to Adam.
Thank you. Hello. Today I'll be talking about additional features of regulation and how this will affect the future prospects of our companies. So, talking about regulation, initially and currently, the EU is the largest setter of regulation that our airlines have to adhere to, which is really important in the context of our airlines, as the EU is their largest market. Ryanair offering 1,600 flights from the EU, and SAS offering to fly to 60 destinations within the EU. Currently, the main objective of EU's regulation is to reduce the environmental impact that air travel has on the environment. We can assume because 26,000 flights operate within the EU every day, and we can see this number is only going to increase as globalisation becomes more popular. Currently, the main tool of the EU in order to reduce this pollution is the EU emissions trading system, wherein firms buy permits to account for their pollution requirements. Firms must not exceed these permits, or they'll have to pay extra to account for their extra pollution over this. Saying this, firms can sell the excess they have left on their pollution, saying that they pollute less than their actual permit requires, meaning that they can cut their costs through doing this. And this sets up a secondary market accounting for the true cost of aviation. Here I've got a graph showing you that as pollution permits, which is this line here, this is them at its lowest price, and this is actually pollution at its highest price, whereas if we go to the next graph, you can see here pollution permits are at their highest, and then look how much the pollution falls between 2007 and 2008, showing that it's a system that does work and a policy that the EU are going to continue to follow and potentially increase the prices of pollution permits. The second factor I'm going to be talking about today is protectionist laws. So protectionism is the process of protecting domestic industry from overseas competition through policy. So currently, the main focus of my view on protectionism is the fact that foreign ownership of EU firms is capped at 49% currently. So we can argue that this allowed SAS to be propped up by the governments of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, and allowed them to act as a flag carrier for those nations. And you can say this protectionist policy has been protecting SAS from the full competition that they might have felt if this limits to foreign ownership was not in place. Saying this, recently there has been huge pressure on the EU to free up markets through reducing this regulation and introducing more liberal policies. The main focus of this, you could say, has been on reducing the limits to foreign ownership, because even firms within the EU are saying they aren't getting the proper foreign capital investment they need to compete and remain competitive in markets. So what does this mean for the future prospects? Well, it means that we have to focus on the ability of both SAS and Ryanair to be able to reduce their pollution in account with the rising price of pollution permits, and perhaps even gain from the system. As one of the chief executives for SAS says that it turns out that good environmental behaviour is also cost effective. So he's referencing here that they can sell the excess on their pollution permits to dramatically reduce their costs. On the other hand, Ryanair is at the top of the UK's pollution table and is the highest polluting Irish corporation ever. Saying this, Michael O'Leary thinks that any increase in price of pollution permits will simply be passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices, and their fare differentials between them and perhaps more high quality airlines will remain exactly the same. Also, we must focus on the ability of SAS to be able to compete in a market where they aren't protected by protectionist laws that mean that they can be shielded from competition by the governments of Norway, Denmark and Sweden.
So to conclude, we can say that the main factor in determining the two outcomes of these companies' successes were the opposing business models. So depending on how geared up they were to react to deregulation. For example, Ryanair's cheap service was already preparing them for when increased competition came into the market after deregulation. Similarly, during the recession, SAS just didn't cut costs fast enough and focused instead on a higher quality service. But in a recession, air travel is usually the first thing to go from the consumer budget. And we just heard from Adam going forward in the future, it's dependent on how well the companies can cut their pollution and how well SAS can cope without their protections. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
What exactly was Star Alliance? Because I saw why it was important, but I didn't know exactly what Star Alliance was.
Star Alliance is an airline group, a world global airline group, and they work together, they fly for each other and book tickets with each other to reduce costs.
Do you think that moving forward, moving forward from the recession, consumers will go back to SAS, thinking that seeing their sort of ideas are all around the environment and having higher price and higher quality rather than Ryanair?
I think that perhaps before the recession this might have been reasonable, but now that consumers' eyes during the recession have been open to the fact that quality and air travel don't necessarily have to go together, and that flying for £10 to France isn't actually the end of the world, and there's no need to pay £150 for marginally more comfortable seats. And true, it's more environmentally friendly, but as Louis said, it's very low on the consumer's checklist, especially when they're looking at something as expensive as flights. So I think now people's eyes have been opened to these budget airlines. I don't really see any turning back anywhere back from it.
I agree. I think even when incomes increase, there's always going to be a market for some sort of inferior or some sort of cheaper good.
With this really quick turnaround time, 25 minutes, has there ever been any disasters or failures because obviously the workers or having to work with such pace?
Well, surprisingly, the disasters and failures were more common on the side of SAS. Ryanair, there hasn't been any major catastrophes, and the one thing, you're talking about workers, there's been occasional moments where, well, there's been a few times where cabin staff have complained and kicked up a real fuss about their working conditions, but it's not necessarily surrounding that 25-minute turnaround period.
Sorry, another. You tend to hear everywhere, everyone's always complaining about Ryanair and saying Ryanair this, Ryanair that. However, there are loads of other low-cost companies. Why do you think Ryanair is so successful within this low-cost industry in comparison to EasyJet or?
I think a lot of that might come down to their publicity stunts. So, for example, Ryanair got in the newspapers a few years ago. They would start charging people to use the toilets, and no other company was brave enough to say that just because it sounds like such a stupid idea to use customers. But it got them into the headlines. They made people realise how cheap their flights were, and that brought revenue.
Yeah, it also leads to this idea that if you think of a low-budget airline, what's the first thing that comes to your head? It's always Ryanair, isn't it? And that's image that they portray themselves. They know their budget and they've just embraced it and just expected the consumer to embrace it too.
And also most of the word marketing. So people just said, oh, a flight going just like recently only for 10 or 15 pounds. So no.
You said that, I think it was from Louis, said that Ryanair had light-hearted controversies. Was it you?
Yes.
Yes. Two questions really associated with that. One, are they all light-hearted? Or do you think any of them actually are quite serious in the controversies that surround Ryanair, albeit that it gives them publicity? And the second thing is, a bit like with Dyson the other week when we were looking at him, how much does this rest on the personality of Michael O'Leary, and is that a strength or a weakness for the company? So you've got two questions
Sure.
there. One, how light-hearted is it always? And two, how much does that rest on O'Leary's personality?
Well, I think if you look at the lightheartedness of the controversies, I think the main thing I noticed is that almost all of them are things that are recoverable. They're not particularly damaging things to the company. It's things they don't necessarily do. However, you could point to things like their environmental impact, which, I mean, most, if not all people argue, really isn't a particularly serious issue. And I think it was on 2 previous slides there about their ordering pilots to fly slightly slower to reduce fuel costs and reduce impact on the environment. So in some sense, they're not joking around with it, but they're playing with something that I think some people believe to be awfully serious. On the point about Dyson personalities, I think that ultimately low costs is what draws people to Ryanair. But I think, as that question just highlighted there, I think Michael O'Leary is what separates the low costs of Ryanair from EasyJet, which are lower, but are not, are unbelievably so. It's not like they're halving EasyJet's costs. It's the case of a couple of pounds. So I think you could really note Michael O'Leary is kind of bringing people. People are already going to the low-cost airlines. I think Michael O'Leary is bringing them to Ryanair instead of EasyJet, is the way I look at it.
Tell me, what did you discover in your research about the place that unions have with the two companies, and what impact do you think that has on business success?
For trade unions, for like
sorry,
Canada.
trade unions.
Well, you don't often get strike action. I've found at least because usually at least their wages are not too low to sort of discourage them from working. But I think during the volcano crisis, the Icelandic volcano, there were complaints because they had to cancel loads of flights, and the cabin crew were actually getting annoyed that they couldn't work, and we're trying to use union action to do that in sort of much just for health and safety reasons.
Which company?
Well, most of the airlines in Europe, because no one could really fly, of course.
Right.
I think.
Will look particular on Ryanair, for example, he opposed to sign the contracts that were backed by unions. So their employees, they're not getting like extra holiday or extra benefits paid after they retire. So he doesn't sign these kind of contracts. People work, people get payment, but they are not like backed by union.
I think also the age of Ryanair employees are much lower than that of BA. I think working as a cabin crew for a low budget airline such as Ryanair is where you start in that industry. So that's where people enter the industry and then move up to BA. I think because they're younger, you can see how trade union membership is falling as the population ages and younger people just aren't interested in joining trade unions. So I think it's becoming less of an issue for those companies that employ an averagely lower age employee opposed to maybe BA or something like that, where there's always getting strike action and stuff like that.
Yeah, and SAS is about the opposite. It's very much with unions is that reflects back on the ages in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark.
Thank you. Tommy, do you think there are any benefits to a regulated airline industry? Obviously, obviously the transition took place, as you identified clearly, in a number of phases. Are there any benefits to having a regulated industry?
I think perhaps environmentally there might be. So in the sense that if it was still as regulated as it was back before 1987, then you might have had more control staying with governments, because currently I think the governments are finding it difficult to regulate, to pass on the true costs of the impact on the environment to these firms. As Mike earlier said, any difference, so any increase in the price of pollution permits, he reckons, will just simply be passed on to the consumer, so that it's not really going to affect the firms as much as the regular people who have set the regulation wanted to, whereas if they were still controlling the price and all of this, they'd have much more control over the environmental footprint.